And then we have two really challenging narrative moments. And so we're going to dive into at least one of them, take a deep dive, and we'll see if we get to the next one. And there's a little bit of midrash we might look at to try and understand some things. So I think we'll have some fun today. The title of the session is I Can Always Complain. I'll start out by saying I think maybe this is if people are familiar with the movie, I would guess that you are, The Big Lebowski, which is not connected in any way to our Parsha this week, at least not to my analysis, except for to say there's a very memorable scene for me where the main character, whose name is Jeffrey, just like me, is sitting in the back of a car and the driver's driving, and he's telling him some kind of a joke, I guess, and the whole thing is, well, like I have this thing wrong with me and that thing wrong with me and this bad thing happened and that bad thing happened and whatever, but you know me, I can't complain, right? And so every time I get to this parsha, I think about that scene because we have the Israelites really they can complain, and I think it's sort of the opposite scenario. But we'll get there. We're gonna start out just by sort of recapping, but also by doing our blessing for the study of Torah. I will bless, and feel free to join me in the amens or on your screen, and you'll see it right up here at the top. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler, sovereign of the universe, who commands us to busy ourselves with the study of Torah. So let's get busy. So just before we get to our current Parsha, B'Ha'alotcha, we were in Parshat Naso. And the very end of that Parsha is a very listy situation where we're really getting ready to start using the altar and the tabernacle. And so all of the tribes need to send chieftains to bring offerings to dedicate the altar. And it is enumerated, each thing that they bring, and we know who from each tribe brought them. Later in this parsha, which we'll get to in a moment, we actually see this list again without the things they brought, but as that is the same order from which they will exit the desert and enter into the land, which is presumably imminent at this point. So when we enter into this parsha, we are sort of continuing that story of preparing the tabernacle. And the first thing is that God is telling Aaron how to set up the lighting array, if you will. So this is one of my questions I want us to think about during this session, is that we start with the parsha is called B'Ha'alotcha. And it's referring literally to B'Ha'alotcha as you raise up the lamps, the menorahs, to put in the tabernacle, in the altar, like how it needs to look. And so my question is, as we go through both this brief summary of the first half of the parsha and then at the end, is that it? Is that all that's being raised up in this chapter? We know that Aaron is literally going to hang some light fixtures. That's the B'Ha'alotcha. It's we know it's a he feel verb. It's causative. He's doing an action. But is that it? Is that why it's called? We know literally, yes, that's the name of the parsha. That's a word that's in the second verse of the parsha. But is there anything else that we might be raising up as we go? So hold that thought. As we continue from there, we see that the Levites' rules are explained, and then the rules governing the Passover offering are enumerated again, and then what to do if one accidentally misses it. There's this really sort of fun moment where somebody comes to Moses and says, hey, like these guys were not pure enough to do they had been around a corpse, so they couldn't give the offering. Should they still do it? And Moses says, hold on, I have to ask God. And then Moses asks God, what do I do? And then Moses says, oh, great question. Or God says, great question. Let me walk you through this, which then also brings us to a command that refers to the ger, so that the stranger that lives among us, and whether or not they have to do the Passover offering, which in another session might be the place where we focus, because there's a lot of commentary that acts, whether it's a proselyte, somebody who's converted to this early Israelite religion, or if that refers to everybody, and whether it's a requirement, and what it has to do with our practice among strangers and strangers among us. But that's not where we're going to stop today. After this, they physically they set up the tabernacle, so they have all the instructions, they have all the offerings, they put it together, and the cloud of God sort of takes up residence within it and around it, and then God commands Moses to make trumpets, and these trumpets are to be blasted in times of war. They're to be blasted both to signify which direction the armies are coming from, which direction their armies will go, when the attack is, and also how to hearken festivals and things as well. So these are multi-purpose trumpets, shofarot, if you will. And then the tribes are listed again, as I mentioned, in that same order. And that's another place where we might spend some time in a future session, because both the order of the tribes is interesting, and the names of who brings them up are all sort of punny when it comes to God and maybe even their status among the brothers and among the tribes. But we won't stop there. And we won't even stop at a very fun part where we see that as they set out, the ark seems to move on its own and flies and does these sort of wacky things. And there's discussions in Midrash and in commentary of what is happening with the ark. And it exists in Talmud and Talmud Yerushalmi. And so know that there's some magical ark stuff going on. And if they say, ark, we need you to defeat our enemies, then it does. And it's like really this incredible object. And we can understand why it was so important to Indiana Jones and all of those folks. We have to keep it a little Hollywood while we're here. Okay, so let's move forward though into what we're going to talk about. So we're going to focus in chapter 11, which is this really famous and sort of troubling scene. But before we go in, I do want to pose a question out to the kahal and see why do people complain? It could be a personal, why do you complain? Why do I can tell you why I complain. I enjoy it deeply, but also I think that it can be productive. But as a good reasons, bad reasons. Susan, I see your hand is up.
Yes, can you enlarge the font?
Sure. I think I can
I
just.
didn't complain. I just asked a question.
No, that's great. That's a wonderful segue. Is that better? Okay. Merle.
I'm thinking only because we were with people the other night who consistently complain. I think they feel they need to be heard. Whether the complaint is legitimate or not, they just want to be heard.
So that would, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. The complaint is it's an internal reason. It's not necessarily to cause any effect. It's really to gratify something from within. Okay, Jonathan.
Actually, I just dealt with complaining. I talked with my mom this morning, and she complained about my daughter and her sister. And I tried to give advice in both of those cases, and it was resisted. So this is a very interesting thing, because I would say the primary reason that a person complains is to get help, right? And when people complain, it tempts a lot of us to want to offer advice. They complain, we want to offer advice, especially like retired military guys like me. But it seems like there is Merle's answer was not, this practical have effect on reality kind of thing. It was very psychological. And I think a lot of people complain in order to there's a certain way in which a person can build themselves up by being right and saying that their environment is wrong. So there is a certain psychology to it, I think. But also fundamentally we make a complaint in order to cause some kind of a result or get some kind of a help or so on. So there's both of those aspects to it, I think.
Cool. So psychological, but also maybe practical.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Anyone else have any thoughts about why? Maybe why you complain? No need. We can just dive right in and see. Anina, yeah, go ahead.
I think it's the fact that they even were allowed to. It's a point that the writer tried to make, that if they were still slaves, they wouldn't be allowed even to complain. So the fact that they were heard and people were listening to them, or to each other at least, it shows that they went up in value. What they said was heard, and people were paying attention to them now. It's a different situation. It's not that they changed a lot, it's just that the situation changed, where they were and how they were listened to, and how whoever heard them were trying to solve those problems, or at least were working on it. And it's to show us that the situation, the background of this whole thing now is a different background than Egypt.
I think that we're gonna find that your thoughts are confirmed. And I want to bring as we go forward, but I want to bring it back to us for a moment before we get to the Israelites and just say I think that that is also a note that sometimes we complain because we feel like we have a right to be heard and we that our circumstances are different.
Exactly. And not only that, those complaints brought results later. The Jethro told him to put judges, and the whole justice system actually was born because they were complaining. And he said, you cannot do it yourself. Put judges and put people that will and divide the job. So
So let's dive in.
Complaining brought the situation a new background to the whole picture.
True. I don't want to cut you off. I just want to make sure we don't get ahead of the story at all.
Right. Okay.
But you're really on the right track, exactly. And so we're gonna dive right in. We've broken up the story into its constituent parts because actually the complaint story, it has a couple of different narratives, and so we're going to go in order, but we're going to stop after each chunk. Is there someone who would be interested in reading the first section, numbers 11, 1 through 6? Go ahead, Rebecca.
The people took to complaining bitterly before Adonai. Adonai heard and was incensed. A fire of Adonai broke out against them, ravaging the outskirts of the camp. The people cried out to Moses. Moses prayed to Adonai, and the fire died down. That place was named Taberah, because the fire of Adonai had broken out against them. The riffraff in their midst felt gluttonous craving, and when the Israelites wept and said, if we had had meat to eat, we remember the fish we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. Now our gullets are shriveled. There's nothing at all, nothing but this manna to look to.
So thank you. This section is crucial. It introduces the story. It introduces this concept that they are now raising a complaint as they are complaining bitterly, although there is a way to translate it also. They were like looking for a pretext to complain. Well, that's in the Midrash. We'll get to that. And then we have this idea that they have no meat to eat, and that they used to eat fish in Egypt. And first, the rabbis wanted us to know, and the commentators, that they actually didn't have free fish in Egypt, lest we think that the Egyptians were giving out free food to the Israelites. Know that it was just cheap, but it wasn't free. But beyond that, they notice a practical problem, which is that prior in the Torah and also later after this, we're going to see that they have meat. They have other things to eat. And so I wanted to just bring two of those examples for you so that we can clarify and start to think right away, what are we complaining about? Because it seems like they actually have what they are wanting. So in Exodus, we see they baked unleavened cakes of dough that they had taken out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, since they had not been driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. That is the wrong verse. I'm so sorry. I just realized. I believe it's actually Exodus 12:32. And I don't even know how this one got in there. So we're going to find it real fast. Nope. Okay. Well, in any case, this is the wrong verse. I apologize. But there's a verse in Exodus that speaks directly to them coming out with a mixed multitude. And within that mixed multitude, there's also a great amount of cattle. So they had cattle when they came out of Egypt, which implies that they had meat. Apologies for the missed verse. And then later in Numbers, this is not in this parsha, and it is in the same book. It's later, but we see that the Reubenites and the Gadites owned cattle in very great numbers, noting that the lands of Jazar and Gilead were a region suitable for cattle. So if they had great numbers of cattle, and if they brought cattle with them out of Egypt, what are they complaining about? Why are they implying that they have no meat? Right? So this is a question that we hold. And then we get a little interlude where it's like all they have to eat is manna, maybe? What did they do with that? What did that look like? So the author felt we needed a recipe. So I'll read this one. Now, the manna was like coriander seed, and in color, it was like bdellium. Bdellium is like a precious gemstone of that time. I don't know what it looks like. I've never seen a bdellium, but I know that's what it is. The people would go about and gather it, grind it between millstones, or pound it in a mortar, boil it in a pot, and make it into cakes. It tasted like rich cream. When the dew fell on the camp at night, the manna would fall upon it. So it wasn't just that they picked up the manna and ate it, but they actually did a whole cooking project with it. And now we'll move forward in the story. But a little bit. The people have just complained to God. And now Moses is going to talk to God. Does anyone have another volunteer to read numbers 10 to 15 or 11, 10 to 15?
Well, volunteer.
Thanks, Susan.
Okay, so Moses heard the people weeping, every clan apart at the entrance of each tent. Adonai was very angry, and Moses was distressed. And Moses said to Adonai, why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not enjoyed your favor, that you have laid the burden of all these people upon me? Did I produce all these people? Did I engender them? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a caregiver carries an infant to the land that you have promised an oath to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all this people when they whine before me and say, give us meat to eat? I cannot carry all this people by myself, for it's too much for me. If you would deal thus with me, kill me. Rather, I beg you, and let me see no more of my wretchedness.
Thank you. So, Penina, this is the beginning of what you were talking about, right? In that the people complain to Moses, they complain against God, and Moses is so upset by this that it actually does prompt God to make a change in the leadership structure. I just want us to take a moment, though, and just note that this is hard for Moses, right? And we think about, like, what is it like? We don't have to answer it now. We'll hold on to it until later. But what is it like when you're trying your best and people complain anyway, right? Maybe it doesn't make you ask God to dispatch you of all your duties, but for Moses, this is really serious, and it may not be the first time or the only time this happens in this chapter.
He's at the end of his tether, and he didn't ask for this assignment. In fact, he tried to avoid it. So,
right.
Here it is.
Here it is. So let's see what God does. Penina, do you want to read this part, since was it your prophecy? Oh, you're muted. Sorry. Still muted. We go.
Okay, which part?
This numbers just 15 to 17.
Okay, in English, yes?
Yes.
Okay. If you would deal thus with me, kill me rather, I beg you, and let me see no more of my righteousness. Then Adonai said to Moses, gather me gather for me 70 of Israel's elders, of whom you have experience as elders and officers of the people, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their place there with you. I will come down and speak with you there, and I will draw upon the spirit that is on you and put it upon them. They shall share the burden of the people with you, and you shall not bear it alone.
Thank you. So this is God responding to Moses's response to the people's complaint, acknowledging, look, we're not gonna, first things first, we're not gonna deal with the complaint. We're gonna deal with you because you're my manager guy, and God is a good boss. He's a good HR, and so he's gonna take care of Moses and try to establish a better system. This will create, though, a slight problem, I think, for our rabbis, and also for the authors of whom we can't be sure as it comes to this, and we'll get there. And actually, in chapter 12, it seems like we're going to deal with sort of the same issue. But there is this question: if Moses is God's right hand man, then what does it mean that God's suddenly going to put the Spirit onto other people? And how is this going to work? And how are we supposed to deal with that as a community? I also want to note this is perhaps one of the first reference checks in recorded history, in that the rabbis say that when God says the elders of whom you have experience as elders and office as elders, that it means like people who are like have been in the field for a while, that Moses can vouch for and has seen that like they can do the job. Like they're not just elders, but they're like elders with experience and with leadership qualities, which I think is kind of cool. At this point, there's probably a lot of elders at this point in the Exodus. Okay, we'll move forward. And so now we've moved away from the structure. We've moved away from those 70 people. So somewhere in the background, we assume that these 70 people are being gathered and that Moses is making a list of who the folks are. But we return to the people. Somebody want to read this section 18 to 23?
I'll do that.
Thank you.
And say to the people, purify yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have kept whining before Adonai and saying, if only we had meat to eat. Instead, we were better off in Egypt. Adonai will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, not 2, not even 5 or 10 or 20, but a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. For you have rejected Adonai, who is among you, by whining before God and saying, oh, why did we ever leave Egypt? But Moses said, the people who are with me number 600,000 foot soldiers. Yet you say, I will give them enough meat to eat for a whole month. Could enough flocks and herds be slaughtered to suffice them? Or could all the fish of the sea be gathered for them to suffice them? And Adonai answered Moses, is there a limit to Adonai's power? You shall soon see whether what I have said happens to you or not.
Thank you. So God's also mad about this. Moses is upset that the people are complaining. God is also mad that the people are complaining and is going to punish them in a very poetic way, but also a really gross way. And what I find really fascinating here, maybe not fascinating, but just entertaining here, is that Moses really is like a very practical guy. He's like, well, I have so many people. So many, hey, how are you going to get all this meat? Where could you get all this from? Which is sort of just a goofy thing to be thinking about after, you're hanging out with the same God who parted the sea for you and has, made the mountain rise out of the desert. And, people could, when they revealed things at Sinai, it's just like this, sort of silly question. And God responds to that by saying this is a silly question. And the Hebrew actually is Ayad Adonai Tiktzar. Is God's hand too short? Is God's arm too short to do anything? And so we see this is, and God says, you'll see. And so we will see. But we won't see yet, because now we actually have to return to that elders thing. So is there another volunteer? I'm also happy to read this section. I got it. I'll do this. We can, we'll take turns. Moses went out and reported the words of God to the people. He gathered 70 of the people's elders and stationed them around the tent. Then, after coming down in a cloud and speaking to him, God drew upon the spirit that was on him and put it upon the 70 participating elders. And when the spirit rested upon them, they spoke in ecstasy or prophesied, but did not continue. Two of the participants, one named Eldad and the other Medad, had remained in the camp, which is to say they were on the list of 70, but they didn't go to the tent. They were just still back. They were among those, right? They'd gone out to the tent and they spoke ecstasy in the camp. It says they prophesied in the camp. And a young assistant ran out and told Moses, saying, Eldad and Medad are acting the prophet in the camp. And Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant from his youth, spoke up and said, My Lord Moses, restrain them. But Moses said to them, Are you wrought up on my account? Would that all of God's people were prophets, that God put the divine spirit upon them. And Moses then re-entered the camp together with the elders of Israel. So this is sort of a solution to that first problem, maybe, that we asked. We're thinking God is and Moses they have the special relationship that God speaks to Moses, and now God is going to speak and allow and give all these other people the power to prophecy. And Moses actually is okay with that. This was Moses' intention all along, but it does show we're going to have some challenges maybe later when it comes to leadership, even now, but when it comes to succession, right? This person who's concerned about it, Joshua, is Joshua, who takes over from Moses after they enter into the land, and who eventually has, questions and needs judges. And so this is a really critical moment, and it's also a moment where we might wonder if the author is recognizing that we're getting kind of close to the end of the story. And Moses, maybe it's not an author, maybe it's a redactor, someone who's aware of the rest of the story, knows that Moses isn't going to make it across. And so what happens when we don't have Moses? And so Moses has to say it's okay. Yeah, Penina, go ahead.
Okay. I really love this area, this section as a teacher. I love it. He's trying, it says here, one sentence says that he was like a mother to them. Adonai Moshe Kelaem, like a mother. And it's like he's trying to give them confidence that they can do it. And he says, you are all like prophets. You can, and literally, and they show, there is like a really, life is really beating there. And you could see even that they have like cows, not sheep or whatever you want to call it. And according to Albright, they found places, the names that are mentioned of places, they were actually trading places. It's not that they were like in a desert that nobody else was traveling in, because we know that they were even involved with wars with other nations till they got to Israel. So it's like amazing the way he kept telling them, you're going to be Moshe Kelaem, you're going to be just like a mother, and tell them that they can do this, that they are all capable. And this is amazing. I love it. To try to instill the self-confidence in these people, like a mother doing to a child. That's awesome.
Thank you. I really appreciate you bringing that out. And it's a beautiful thing. And it's also like, we think about this with Moses a lot, right? What was Moses to God, but what was Moses to us, to the people? And I think that mother encouraging figure is like maybe some of Moses's best work. Thank you. Okay, but enough about those elders. Let's get back to the people. Do I have a volunteer to read the last part of this chapter? Go ahead, Rebecca.
A wind from Adonai started up, swept quail from the sea, and strewed them over the camp. About a day's journey on this side, and about a day's journey on that side, all around the camp, and some 2 cubits deep on the ground. The people set to gathering the quail all that day and night, and all the next day. Even the one who gathered least had 10 homers. They had spread them out all around the camp. The meat was still between their teeth, not yet chewed, when the anger of Adonai blazed forth against the people, and Adonai struck the people with a very severe plague. That place was named Kibroth Hata'ava, because the people who had the craving were buried there. And the people set out from Kibroth Hata'ava for Hazeroth. When they were in Hazeroth,
That's it. That's a bad translation at the very end. It's really just, and they were in Hazara.
Oh.
But thank you. Yeah. So this is what happened. So first, when people say like I'm up to my ears in whatever, the quail is 2 cubits deep. For me, I'm up to my ears in quail. So let's get that out there first. But this is like an intense situation. They're eating it, and then they get a plague, right? So God says, I'll give you what you asked for and then some, right? So this is the end of this story, essentially. And I'm curious what your impressions are. We're going to look in a moment into 2 pieces of Midrash from Sifrei Bamidbar, which is it's technically a halachic midrash, meaning it's a midrash where the rabbis try to figure out and try to derive law and like from where that comes. But they also peppered in a ton of Aggadic material, which is like legends and stories. And so we have some Aggadic material about this story that we'll get to in a moment. But first, yeah, Susan, go ahead.
So you asked what our impression was of this. I just think this is a recompense or a punishment for gluttony. You want this, I'll give this to you, I'll give it to you in excess. And they were like animals here. The meat was between they spread it all around them. It was between their teeth, not yet chewed, and then they got the plague. So it's gluttony writ large, I think. And then they spread it around the camp, and it was deep and so on. I mean, they're choking on their own excess, and it's kind of like deserved. And then they were buried there, and the plague broke out. So, we could say that as a midrash, extrapolating from that of excess and gluttony. I mean, it could be in money, it could be in
They may have not cooked it.
and they had not cooked it. That's the other thing. That was in the Noahide laws even. You can't eat raw meat. Even the manna, which wasn't a meat, they cooked. But this was raw. I mean, it's like raw animal kind of instincts.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I also think that's interesting. I didn't even think about comparing it to the manna, but I wonder if perhaps that's one of the reasons that we get that description in this very chapter, sort of interpolated with the story of what they did with the manna to draw that contrast, right?
Yes.
That the manna is not meat and they prepared it, and they did nothing. They just started eating it up. Thank you. Yeah. Jonathan.
Well, one thing is, so my dad actually used to hunt quail and come back from hunting weekends with trash bags full of them. And I used to be forced to eat these things as a child.
So you've lived
and
this.
I can tell you it's not good meat. What you get after a prepared bird is basically like a big walnut kind of chest section that's almost entirely bone that you're trying to get a little bit of meat out of, and it tastes pretty bad. And I thought, when I looked at this, I thought, well, when somebody's complaining about meat, if they don't have an aversion to red meat, then they're usually going to want a big beefy steak or something like that. If they do, then they're going to want some like meaty, tasty, flightless bird like chicken or turkey or duck or even goose. Quail is not the answer to anyone who says my food is not good. I want good food. And then the second thing is that, it's a bird, which is a completely different kind of an offering than the the lambs and everything along those lines. And it kind of makes me curious as to what the underlying significance of these bird style offerings are. I really don't know, but I think there's probably some kind of a play on here where you wanted you were asking for the Passover lamb, or you're asking for the bull of the burnt offering. You were asking for this, but you got this quail, some other kind of a category it's not what you were looking for is the main thing. And then on top of that, it comes with this plague. So obviously, I think the my takeaway from it is, if you come from a perspective of entitlement and anger and hostility and lack of gratitude, whatever you get is ultimately not going to be satisfying and possibly accompanied with your destruction, is sort of what I take away from that. Yeah, I don't really know enough about the whole offering symbolism to really offer more, but that's basically what I take from that story.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I really appreciate you bringing in like the realities of quail. I know this. I don't know exactly what type of bird it was back then and over there, but I know just a quick Google I did while researching for this, that only also, I don't know if anyone else says they do a Google, but I like to say it that way. So I did a Google and I looked up quail and whether or not they're kosher, right? Because some flightless bird, I mean, most birds that are flightless are not, but the way that we see quail hunted, at least in media, is that they're like flying out of somewhere, kind of, unless I'm thinking of a different kind of bird, but I'm not a hunter, so I don't know. But in any case, there are some species that are kosher, and there are some species that are not considered kosher. And so, granted, of course, like, they didn't have the Orthodox Union back then to tell them what was kosher or not. But we also might wonder, like, whether the meat that was swept up from the sea and strewn over the camp and given to them, was it even meat that they were allowed to eat? I'm not sure. Yeah. Any other impressions before we go into the midrash to see what the rabbis thought? Merle, go ahead.
I was just going to say we have a lot of quail running around our neighborhood, and it doesn't look like anything I would choose to eat. The other thing is years ago, we were in a restaurant somewhere in Colorado where all the food had been like hunted food. And I was, gonna try something. I don't even remember it might have been buffalo or something. And I thought something about what I had eaten just wasn't worth the anxiety that I had, that I was so excited that I got to eat this food. It wasn't worth the anxiety that I had when I ate it, and it wasn't all that good. I mean, it was kind of like, I'm eating this, I'm hungry, why am I bothering? And I'm kind of thinking of that when I think about, especially with the quail. I look at these quail in the morning that are running across our lawn, and I'm like, I'm thinking those just aren't, especially the babies. The adults aren't worth eating. The babies, like I think Jonathan said, it was like eating a walnut, the size of a walnut. It's just not, it's not worth wasting your appetite on.
Ahead,
it's about this whole parsha, and it's desperation.
I think that's an interesting yeah, no, I think there is an element of that for sure. And I think also, like, there is this also just like, what happens when you complain and then you do get it? What do you do with it? Yeah, go ahead, Panina.
I think that I don't like if questions, because we really don't know what they did with it. I think that the whole idea of the story is to prepare us for the laws that will come later, the need for those laws. So I think the story is maybe one of the reasons that showed up that the need for the laws of kashrut was invented, to alleviate all these stomachache and sickness. So they are not saying that it's going to be 100% proof, but they are giving you at least some options. So don't eat everything because it might make you sick. So be a little bit, take your time. Don't jump like this and be so quick to eat whatever it is that's there. So all those things that happening to them, it's kind of like preparing the ground for the laws to come.
That future
The
discernment
need
we'll have
for
to
these
do.
laws.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have the 10 Commandments. It all came out of need. To
Thank
give
you.
them structure, to give them directions. And the whole idea of the kashrut also has to do with soaking the meat. You soak it with salt. So to take out all the blood and stuff. Here, they didn't soak it. They just ate it.
There's no
So
brining. Yeah.
there is a lot of things that are involved, and to just think of exact what it is, the if question doesn't matter. What matters is what came after. The law came after. You have to soak it in salt. You got to cook it. You got to whatever. Not everything. It has to be a certain kind of bird. It has to be a certain kind of animal.
Right.
I always say that. I always tell this. I always tell this. I bring it. Dugma, how do you say an example? You know that the giraffe is kosher. Did you know that?
No.
Giraffe is kosher, yes. It has a split hoof like the
Choose
cow.
its cud, right?
Yeah, and it chews its cud. The only thing is they don't ever kill it because they don't know exactly the place in the throat that's going to be the right spot to slit it so it won't suffer when it dies. So thanks God for the long neck.
Yeah.
Nobody knows where exactly it is. So I'm sure that if they today with the X-rays and all this stuff, they could have figured it out, but I don't think they want to.
No,
So
giraffes are
it's a
cool.
matter of choices. Yeah, it's too pretty. It's too gorgeous. I mean, whatever. So I think it's just everything is preparation
Sure.
to lead us to the point of here is why we have the laws. That's it.
Yes, thank you. I think
Okay.
that's a good reading, and I think it's one that is, we have a whole Mishnah and a Talmud and all that, which would back
Yeah,
you up. So,
yeah.
all right, Merle, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking, and it goes along with what Panita said. All those years ago, I don't think they thought about kashrut or health reasons, which is a lot of what
Or marinating.
right, what kashrut is about. But I think they just ate because it was shoved in front of them and they didn't look at it as a punishment or whatever. Whereas now, as a diabetic, I have to look at or ask about everything I eat and what's in it, or what was it. It wasn't kosher necessarily, but how was it prepared and everything else. And I think we think about things very differently in our current lives than we did even 100 years ago. I think eating is a whole different perspective now. And with health issues in today's world, eating the wrong thing can be a punishment to yourself. How
Yep.
greedy were you that you had to have that food and then you got sick from it? And then it becomes, you don't think of it as a punishment, but it is a punishment.
You're so right. I think that's so true. And also, I'm thinking of someone with food allergies that, you have, not that it's a punishment, certainly I can't help it. But,
Right.
there are certain things I know if I eat it, I'm going to suffer or die. And so, it depends. And so and it necessitates that in my family and in my home, we have our system, we keep kosher, but we also think about things in terms of what's K for J, kosher for Jeff, instead of K for P, kosher for Pastor, K for J, right? Like, not only is it kosher, but also is it safe to eat? We all have some amazing, you all are really, really diving into this and pulling out some amazing ideas. And I really appreciate it. And I want to go forward just a little bit so we can see, I don't know if we'll really get through the next story, but we can look and see just briefly what the rabbis of the Midrash say about this story, about the complaints. This is a little bit. So what we need to know, just really briefly before we go in, that one of the styles in Midrashic interpretation is to look at a verse and say that each word in the verse means something else about the story, which gives us some kind of context and meaning. So they do it for every word in the verse, but I isolated just the part about the first word because I think it gives us our most useful tool for what we've been talking about. And I'm going to read it just because there's a lot of brackets and things and it gets a little wacky. So, and the people were as complainers, kemit onenim, right? So vayahi, they're saying, is the word that says vayahi ha'am kemit onenim. Vayahi is the word that is the conjugation of the verb to be, which tells us, based on the biblical Hebrew, that they were. But the rabbis of the Midrash want us to know that it actually connotes a return to a previous conditions. And so initially they were perverse or they were complainers, and they reverted to their original condition before this happened. So that's one little story that actually, like, at least one of the rabbis in the school of Rabbi Yishmael, where we think this set of Midrash came out of, at least one of those rabbis thought that there was no good reason to complain at all, and there was no value to it, and it was just because the people were complainers, and they had stopped complaining for a little while, and now they went back to complaining. But Rabbi Eliezer says that kamitonanim, which is the Hebrew word for as complainers, actually connotes blows. And he brings us a verse from Proverbs to prove that to us, saying that the words of the grumbler, the complainer, are like blows, meaning like getting hit. And they bring another verse from Devarim, and you grumbled in your tents. And then they want to ask, what are the blows here in our context? They were as if they struck blows, but a knife descended from heaven and split their innards, which is so to say they burst from all they ate and that kind of thing. And they give us another verse from Proverbs saying, and they descend to the recesses of the stomach, which tells us that if the words are like blows, it then goes down into your stomach, and that causes the illness and the punishment. So this is a very sort of graphic but literal idea. Rabbi Yehuda says, though, kamitonanim connotes those who afflict themselves. And he produces a verse from Devarim, which Deuteronomy, which says, I did not eat in my mourning, but oni of it. And he uses that oni is mourning. And so kamit onanim, he thinks it's not so much as like complainers, but more like mourners. So we're doing a lot of wordplay here. But I think what's really important is this part. We're going to actually just skip over a little bit, and we're going to pick up right here, right? They say, for you will do evil in the eyes of the Lord, in the ears of the Lord. From these verses, we are taught, so it's a continuing thing. From these verses, we are taught that Israel deliberately intended for God to hear their complaints. And Rabbi Shimon makes an analogy saying, it's as if a man is cursing the king, and when the king passes by, they tell him, hush, the king might hear. And he says, who told you that I don't want the king to hear? So in this instance, Israel wanted God to hear. God heard, and God's wrath burned in them. And that's why in the completion of this first part, the first and second verse, the fire of the Lord burned in them. But we'll remind ourselves of that whole verse where the loathsome, where we see this, where it says that God, that they were loathsome to God. It says, but a whole month, this is about the quail, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. For you have rejected God who is among you by whining and saying, oh, why did we ever leave Egypt? So that verse, the rabbis then take it to mean that they actually were complaining because they wanted God to hear them. But why would they want God to hear them? We're going to skip ahead to the it's not the very next, but it is a few paragraphs later in the same midrash, and they take that verse. They say, and it will become loathsome to you. Say, you will repel it more than you courted it. So that's a good lesson for us, right? That this is, I think, what we've talked about a lot, that when you really complain and you desire something, you might get too much of it. So, for you have despised the Lord who is in your midst. God said to them, what caused you to say such things? My having reposed my Shekhinah among you, my heavenly spirit. For if I had removed my Shekhinah from you, you would not have swelled with pride to utter such things. So God, in the end, in this midrash, blames God's self and says, actually, it's my fault. I decided to dwell among you. You set up the tabernacle, and I went down and I let you think that you were too special because I was with you. And so then you felt like you could complain against me, which still doesn't really add up for me. But I think we might experience, the rebellious child who, despite being given all that they ask for, still finds a way to be rude to their parents. I don't know. We have only about 5 minutes left, so we're gonna really breeze through this next thing. We're not gonna actually read the story, which is not what I like to do, but I really want us to think about it for a moment. The very next thing that happens is there's this moment where Miriam and Aaron speak against Moses's wife, and they say he took a Cushite woman, and then they get haughty and they're like, God also talks to us and not just Moses. So first we need to understand what they're mad about. And there's been a lot made of this that says like, oh, well, we know that Cush is a region in Africa, and so they probably are saying that they didn't like that he was with an African woman, and so there's racism in there, and that may be a part of it. But really, I think the commentary actually gets it. They are making it an illusion. They're saying as a Cushite woman is like beautiful, so too is Zipporah, his wife, righteous, and he's divorced her. This is a thing that it's sort of low key in the Tanakh, but Moses is like sort of our first divorce, and he and Zipporah are separated. And so they're actually not upset that he took a Cushite woman into their household, but they're upset that Moses is in this high esteem and he just got divorced. And they're not sure why that there may be different rules that apply to Moses that apply to everybody else, even though it's not actually the case. And so God says to them, look, when prophets arise among you, like I speak to them in a vision, or I speak to them in a vision or in a dream, but Moses I speak to face, which you might wonder why they brought that up. But I actually think it responds to our problem in chapter 11, when we gave all the people the power of prophecy. And if you were still concerned that maybe somebody other than Moses is getting to talk directly with God, and that we've lost the transmission is now getting muddier, and that the special relationship has changed. Here again, we have this example to say, no, Moses has it one way, everybody else gets it a different way. And Moses' way is more direct and more pure. And as a result of this, though, this is how God responds to Miriam and Aaron, saying, why Moses? And God talks to us too. He then gives Miriam what some people say it's leprosy. And she is punished, and then Moses and everyone pray for her to be healed. And she's set outside the camp for a week, and then she's healed. She comes back, and they march on. And that's the end of the Parsha. And so to do it no justice, I want to know why the story is here and why we're looking at it. So first, I think that it serves a purpose to continue to clarify Moses' special position, and to further legitimize that future prophets will be prophets, but just have a different method of communicating with God. But also, Sifrei Bamidbar has this really fascinating moment where they get into it, which is less maybe why it's in the story, although maybe it is, but is totally why we're talking about it. So they say in the verse, is it only with Moses that the Lord has spoken? Did God not also speak with our forefathers? And did they not separate from their wives? Has he not spoken also with us? And we have not separated from our spouses? So there's this real concern about the marital relationship. And Penina, I'll get to you in just one moment. I just want to close it. And the Lord heard. We continue on. We are hereby apprised that no one else was there, but they spoke between themselves. But Rabbi Natan disagrees and says they also spoke this to Moses' face, it being written, and God heard, and the man Moses. But Moses suppressed it. In the Hebrew, there is kavashet, which means like he actually had to like really conquer those feelings within himself and not get upset with them. So we have these two stories where the people complain to God, and God hears to Moses about God, and God hears it. And we think from this midrash that they wanted God to hear. And here, again, we have this moment of people complaining to God now about Moses, and Moses overhears. And so there's this question, right? What do we make of this overhearing people's complaints, and what the meaning of complaint are? So with our last 2 minutes, I'm going to say, what was really being raised up in this parsha? B'ha'alotcha, was it the lamps, or was it complaints, or was it the value or the status of other people in Israel and in the ability to prophecy? But I also think there's a lesson here about being careful about complaining, and maybe even actually being more careful about who hears you, right? But really, what we might understand is only complain to bring about good change. If we had to like put one tachlis lesson, and be aware of how your words can affect other people, right? We know that things are going to be complainable. I can vouch for that. I do it often, but we should really only do it with the best intentions in our heart. So with 1 minute left, I hate to be like, does anybody have any final thoughts? But any last words, Cindy? Yeah.
Since we know that Zipporah was a Midianite, is it possible that he had a second wife that was Ethiopian? Is my number one thing. And the other point is, I know this sets up the whole very strong Orthodox tradition of not gossiping. And that's really a sin in their community, although I know we tend to do it too much.
I bet they do too, but I think, but you're right. I think it sets up those things, and also I don't know that I'm not sure if Moses could have had a second wife. I don't think that Moses could not have had a second wife, but we don't have a scene of a marriage. Panina, I thought your hand was up.
I think it's like when you're talking to somebody and you're telling them something. Okay, they ate this meat and they got sick and people died. And then it's like you continue the conversation and you say, and you know what else could hurt you? The fact that you are going to tell a lie about somebody else. You can hurt another person and kill him, just like the meat killed the people that wanted too much. So therefore, another thing that could kill you is Lashon Hara. So they brought a story of something else that could kill you because they were on a subject of what could kill you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. Susan, and then Rebecca, and then we'll almost send everyone out of here to Shabbat. Although I feel like, Jonathan, you might have had your hand raised for a second before. Was that an accident, or did you want to say something?
My text has just this little note that says Cushite apparently includes Midianites and other Arabic peoples.
Yeah. That's what I was gonna say. It's an Aramite, Etz Chaim says that Kushan was a region of Midian. So a lot has been made. It was the Ethiopian and race consciousness today. Oh, that means they're prejudiced against Black people. But I don't know that that's really the case. I agree with Cindy wholeheartedly. It's gossip. It's a caveat against gossip, Lashon Hara, and Penina brought that up. But it's also something about paying attention to your family, which she did. What happened to Zipporah after she circumcised, was a bridegroom of blood and circumcised in that weird passage. Right. So I think there are several lessons in there as well. So.
Thank you. And we could also complicate the geography further by noting that in this ancient world, Kush was another name for regions that are now India and Pakistan. So there's also that. Sorry, Jonathan, go ahead. I know you.
Oh no, I didn't. It was a quick accident thing. So
no worries. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for being part of this lesson and for sharing your insights and thoughts. And if you have any complaints, make sure you register them to someone, but don't let me hear. And really, I hope you have a wonderful Shabbat and stay safe and healthy and continue to have a wonderful summer.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.